Welcome to episode 2 of the Christchurch Fox Chapel podcast, the fastest growing conservative, evangelical, charismatic Anglican podcast in the entire Fox Chapel area. And I'm joined today by the musical genius that is Robert Fire, our music minister, and Ben Woolpe, our curate, who will also be preaching, or in fact, by the time you hear this, will have preached on our passage for today, which is from the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, verses 1 through to 9. And I've asked Robert if he'd be kind enough to read that for us.
Ephesians 6. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with the promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters and with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him.
Well, thank you very much. So, to begin our conversation, as always, what strikes us from this particular passage?
Well, there's some context necessary here, right? As we're reading through Ephesians 5 and chapter 6. And we talked last time about how the whole passage in end of chapter 5 with wives and husbands was governed by chapter 5, verse 21, where we're called to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And so this is still following along under that governing principle and talking about different types of relationships, children and parents, slaves and masters, or I think we can just apply that to workers and bosses and any kinds of authorities in our lives or our societies.
Yeah, I mean, the passage, if you do look at it from 5:21 through to 6:9, it's sort of hedged with the same thing as well, where, as it ends here, that our master in heaven is Jesus, and there's no partiality with him. That sort of sense of us all being treated equitably by him. It is shocking, though. I mean, I imagine that anybody hearing this for the first time is going to hear bondservants in the ESV translation. Some older books will probably just use the word slave.
Yeah.
And that is worthy of some serious discussion.
Yeah.
You know, what's the Bible doing? Recommending slavery? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, I don't think so. As far as I interpret it, what do you think, Robert?
Well, I think we're looking at a letter to a certain church at a certain time where there are certain relationships in place, and Paul addressing society as it was at that time.
Yeah, I think that's good. And in fact, really sort of undoing it a bit. I'm sure that as we looked at husbands having enormous power over their wives, parents, fathers in particular, had enormous power over their children, and masters, owners of people, had enormous power over their slaves. And yet here is this incredible remark that actually masters do the same. I'm looking at verse 9. For those with Bibles open at home, masters do the same to them. That's an extraordinary thing. There's a reciprocal.
Yeah.
That would have been unheard of at the time.
Yeah. Well, it's so Paul's not condoning slavery, we say, but he's speaking into the structures that exist in the society, because they need to know about Jesus. They need to know about the gospel and what is the nature of authority and what's the nature of service and submission. And it strikes me that as he's talking about the nature of authority based on the model of Jesus Christ, that there is an equity there because everyone has the same master, which is the Lord, but also that those who have authority wield it for the good of those who are in submission or under authority, rather.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to jump back to the children point, you get that there as well in verse 2 and 3, that the children honouring their parents have a benefit from this. It actually goes well for them in the land.
Yeah, and that's in the Ten Commandments. That's one of it's the fifth commandment, right? That we were to honor our father and our mother. So this is like on the same level as don't kill, don't steal, honor don't have idols.
Yeah, same list.
Same list.
I mean, I like this. Fathers, do not provoke your children. I am. Well, we're all dads in this room, and sometimes children can be provocative, and we are actually probably better at provoking our children than they are us. We have that ability. It is tempting sometimes to just wind them up when they're winding you up. I mean,
definitely.
I'm confessing that. I don't know. Robert's too good.
No. Well, my kids are just older now, so I think the dynamic changes. Yeah. But if you're doing this as unto Christ, as we're to be doing everything, and in place of love in these relationships, we're supposed to love the Lord our God and love our neighbor, love the people around us as ourselves. And if we try, imperfect as we are, if that's our approach, then provoking people probably shouldn't be at the top of our list.
Yeah, and it seems like verse 4, he's putting provoking your children as the opposite of our real job, which is bringing them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord.
Right.
Do not provoke your children, but do your job, which is to bring them up in the Lord.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe that's linked to what it says here in verse 5 about sincere hearts. So you just think about our homes, particularly, we three who have a job at the front of the church, and our kids see us have this job. And we stand up at the front and we say, here's a load of stuff. I've got 10 great ideas for the congregation to go home and do. My kids hear me preach this, and then I go home and I'm a different creature.
Yeah.
Have I brought them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord, or have I just completely trashed their faith?
Yeah, well, that can be hugely destructive, right? When you see hypocrisy in any setting. No one is going to want to hear what you think you have to say if what they're witnessing in your behavior is the antithesis of that.
Well, I think that's the perennial problem of pastors' kids, ministers' kids. There's the trope of they're the rebellious ones, and they end up walking away from their faith. And I think that's where ministers, and really we're talking about everyone, haven't taken their responsibility to minister to their family and to bring their children up in the Lord. And that's not always on the father, the mother. Children make their own decisions, but certainly our principal job should be ministering to our families and bringing up our children in the Lord.
And then when we jump to work, we see a similar thing. Obviously, in our case, we work for a church, and that's unusual, but it's a principle that applies to all things. If in my office on a Tuesday when we get together, effing and jeffing and just absolutely full of filth, really? Do I want to work with this guy? And maybe even more, is it incumbent upon you at some point to kind of report me? The sincerity is so, and it's hard because we're good friends. We get to see our weaknesses and fears as well as. Yeah,
and then he's talking to the bond servants, the workers, and telling them to submit and to work with sincere hearts in obedience, because you're bond servants of Christ, and because you are a worker for Christ, ultimately. As is your boss, as is the authority that you're submitting to. So you submit to the authority, even if maybe you don't always agree with them. Like we know something about that. Alex and I have sometimes disagreed, but he's the boss, and so I his way goes, and I'm very happy 95% of the time to go with that.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, we have this principle here. The guiding principle from 5:21 is a principle of the staff team. It is our staff verse, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And so, okay, I'm the rector, but I'm always assuming that my job is to try and serve everyone else and not just have my own way because I've got the biggest room and a chandelier and a mahogany desk and a decanter of whiskey and the accoutrements of power,
But you serve with the authority of Christ. The authority you bear is his authority, which was to lay his life down and to serve and to give his life. So by leading, by being the authority, your job is to build others up and to work for the good of those who you have authority over.
So just thinking for a moment about those who don't have the luxury of working for, a well-heeled country parish in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. What if your boss is an absolute scumbag? And I've worked in very aggressive offices. I was working at 3 a.m. once and on a case for a partner who came and screamed in my face and spit was landing on my face. Not good for these corona times. And he even started insulting the cheapness of my suit. Which, I mean, it was a horrible suit, but that was rough. What do we do? I tell that story, but I bet every one of us has a story like it. I've got 5 stories like it. What about that? What hope is there in this passage for us? Or what, if you're stuck at home with a really difficult parent?
Well, we believe in a God that is sovereign and omniscient and is everywhere that we are and has experienced what we're experiencing. And we found him to be very trustworthy. We can trust him. And we know there will be a day of justice. And that's his job. And so we're called to serve others even in the difficult situation, trusting that he is ultimately in charge of that situation and every other situation. And there is no partiality with him. Yeah. And I also think, the older I get, I tend to be, I think of that boss that was treating you that way, like what is so sad in his life? What is he afraid of? Right? Functioning from a place of fear is so often why we mistreat other people, because we're afraid.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so what was he afraid of? What was his situation that would have him abuse you?
Yeah, and you don't know the witness that a good employee can have on a person like that. Yeah. A person who is working from a place of reason and peace when there's unreasonableness and anger coming from your boss. That can be a really powerful witness, to be the peaceful presence in an unpeaceful environment.
Yeah, your response being not like how you've been treated, and what is caught more than taught in that situation.
And in our attitude, he says, verse 7, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to men.
Right.
So like in everything, Paul says elsewhere, in all that you do it as unto the Lord. I think that's 1 Corinthians something.
Right.
So like all that we're doing, whatever job you're working, no matter how menial, how important, how meaningful to you or not, whatever you're doing, we need to be working as unto the Lord. And our service is rendered to the Lord, not simply to men and women. And I think that can shape a lot of our attitudes, of our perspectives, and our actions in the workplace.
I mean, there's a final thought really for this podcast, and our work lives and our home lives are in the process of being turned upside down. So we're working remotely, or maybe we're out of work. We're cooped up with our children who are probably studying remotely. There's not so much space. There's the real stress of getting sick, and almost the bit where you think you might be getting sick is almost worse than being sick sometimes because of the unknown. I think, what encouragement can we end with as a team for anybody who's in that situation is my question from this passage.
I think there's a real difficulty here too in honoring your father and mother. I mean, I was supposed to go visit my parents this week and bring my kids to spend some time with their grandparents, and I just had to cancel the trip because I want to honor my father and mother. I want to not get them sick. I want to not spread this thing and I want to expose them. And I think we can use the same principle for honoring our elderly and vulnerable among us. The spiritual fathers and mothers, those who are elderly, who are more susceptible. To honor them is to practice the right physical distancing and to take care of them as best as we can without exposing them.
Yeah. And of course, many people will know this listening, that we're actually quite well acquainted with suffering as a staff team. The staff team has been through the last 5 years a real litany of horrific things of the most serious nature, life-threatening injuries, life-threatening disease, and all sorts of disruptions to our family lives that have been incredibly difficult. This is really the way of life, isn't it, in a fallen world? The virus that we're experiencing is certainly changing situations in the sort of immediate, but it's not really changing anything in the big story. It's just making it a bit clearer. I'm struck by the fact that wives, husbands, children, parents, bondservants and masters are all addressed in the same breath.
Yeah.
This applies to all of us. Well, thank you for joining us, the Christchurch Fox Chapel podcast. Let us know, please, how you are finding this. If there's anything we can change about the way we're doing it as we get our eye in on this new system, let us know if it's helpful. And stay tuned next week for the Armour of God. God bless.